The Supreme Court's decision on that Proposition 8 case raises some complicated questions. Now, they ruled that those defending Prop 8 didn't have standing to do so, meaning the court couldn't rule on Prop 8 itself. That seems to revert the fate of Prop 8 back to a district judge who ruled years ago that it's unconstitutional. So what does this all mean? We're joined by Susan Frederick to try to sort through this very complicated stuff. There's been this debate all day. Does this mean that same-sex couples in California can now get married? What do we think about that?
Well, it seems if you look directly at the court's ruling that that would be the case. What is unclear is whether or not that district court decision was really the last word on the subject, and whether or not the state would want to go back and take action, maybe going the other way based on the ballot initiative of Proposition 8.
Is there a possibility where something could shift in California and it is not so simple, that maybe that this wasn't enough to make marriage legal in California, same-sex marriage? Or are we basically at the will of Jerry Brown to say, the governor of California, who came out today and said they were going to start issuing licenses, and there's kind of no one to stop him?
Well, I think the citizens in California can certainly offer up another ballot initiative if they get enough signatures and meet the state requirements to do so, just as they did with Proposition 8.
But
They're
what would
certainly
they do?
free
They
to do
already
that.
did this. They amended their constitution. They defined it as a man and a woman, and then there was no one to defend what they had voted for.
Well, there was at one point, and they lost. So the question then becomes is how many bites at the apple do you really get? In this case, the Supreme Court deferred to the district court ruling as the last place where there was standing to argue the case.
But what's interesting is if that district court had ruled the other way, and those plaintiffs could have appealed again, they would have continued to have standing.
Yes.
Because the Supreme Court said they did have standing because they were injured by Prop 8. So they could have challenged it all the way to the Supreme Court. But once they won that first time, the Supreme Court says today there's no one outside of elected state representatives who can challenge Prop 8.
That's right. And they're not going outside of what has traditionally been their rulings in these types of cases. There have been other cases that have come before, not about gay marriage, but about other issues involving legislatively enacted statutes and rules that were challenged appropriately by members of the legislature, but once they lost their position as members of the legislature, they also lost their standing. So this is not out of line.
In the DOMA case, Justice Kennedy wasn't that technical about it. He discussed in kind of like civil rights terms the rights of these same-sex couples to be recognized should they live in states that have decided same-sex marriage is legal. Do we extrapolate in any way, since we didn't get a Proposition 8 decision on the merits, what this says for whether these state DOMA laws would be seen as constitutional or not when that gets to the Supreme Court? Like, if you're in these 36 states that don't allow same-sex marriage, are you concerned today that maybe the Supreme Court is leaning towards the day where they say, no states, you don't get to make that decision?
Well, I think the court drew a very bright line this morning in saying that family law, domestic relations issues, and issues related to marriage have always been within the purview of the state.
They struck down DOMA because it was getting in the way of the state's ability to define.
Right, it was getting in the state's ability to do what that state wanted to do within its own state.
So it's a battle that will be waged at the state level?
Yes.
Okay, last thing, as you see the coverage today, biggest mistake or wrong focus or misunderstanding out of what's happened today? What aren't people understanding correctly?
I think just the scope of the opinions themselves is not as broad as it was sort of touted to be prior to the decision. And I think people think that with the throwing out of the federal DOMA, that there's some mass, approval nationwide of same-sex marriage, and that's not at all what the case said. And I think people need to understand that this has actually more of a narrow focus than the media was projecting even as early as 10 o'clock this morning.
Okay, Susan, thanks for walking through a bunch of it for us.
Yeah, you bet.